Welcome to Revelation Unraveled. I'm your host, William Tapley, also known as the third eagle of the apocalypse and the co-prophet of the end times. This is part 3 in my series on World War III and the defeat of America and our last president, Barack Obama, as described in chapter 11 of that great Old Testament prophet, Daniel. Let's review quickly how Daniel uses numerology to set up the identities of these last great personages in the end times. As I have explained, Daniel breaks up the first 12 verses into a 4-4-4 sequence. The following 18 verses are in a 6-6-6 pattern, and the last 15 verses are in a 5-5-5 sequence. Now let's look at these last 10 verses, which describe the last king of the north, who is the premier of Russia, the last king of the south, who is Barack Obama, and the Antichrist. Daniel describes this sixth and last king of the north, beginning in verse number 36. And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall be lifted up, and shall magnify himself against every god. This refers to communism, because the official religion of communism is atheism. And Daniel continues, and he shall speak great things against the God of gods, and he shall prosper till the wrath be accomplished. I believe Daniel is predicting here that this last king of the north, who will be victorious in World War III, will survive until Armageddon. In verse 37, Daniel makes an interesting observation about this premier of Russia. He shall follow the lust of women. Now this is the Douay-Rheims translation. In the King James Version, instead of lust, the translators said that this last king of the north had no regard for women. Now I'm not sure which it is, but in any case, it's obvious that this last king of the north has some kind of disconnect with women. In verses 37 and 38, Daniel makes several more extremely important observations about this premier of Russia. And he shall make no account of the God of his fathers, but he shall worship the god Maozim in his place. Now the God of his fathers would be the Russian Orthodox religion. And in this case, the word Maozim has been transliterated. That is, Maozim is exactly how the word is spelled and pronounced in the original language. In the King James Version, Maozim is translated fortress. But the word Maozim has a very important end times meaning, because Maozim means Muslim. And in this passage, Daniel is saying that the Russian premier will support the Muslim cause. The last Gog-Magog coalition is with Russia and the Muslim nations of the world. Now in verse 38, Daniel writes, but he, that is the premier of Russia, shall worship the god Maozim in his place. That is, he supports the Muslims and abandons his Russian Orthodox faith. And a god whom his fathers knew not, he shall worship with gold and silver. I believe this God, whom his fathers knew not, is nuclear power. And what Daniel is saying is that he will spend a great deal of money on developing nuclear weapons. And in verse 39, he shall do this to fortify Maozim with a strange god, that is nuclear power, whom he has acknowledged. And he shall increase glory and shall give them power over many. We see this today with the Russians supplying the Muslim world with nuclear power. As I reported in the first part on this series, verse number 40 describes World War III between the premier of Russia and the President of the United States. And Daniel writes, at the time fixed, the king of the south, that is the President of the United States, Barack Obama, shall push against him. That is, he is going to provoke the premier of Russia. And the king of the north shall come against him like a tempest. with chariots and horsemen and with a great navy. The tempest means air power, airplanes and missiles. And of course, the chariots refers to mechanized armor. And then Daniel describes the end of America. And he shall enter into the countries and shall destroy and pass through. The countries refer to England and America. Now, following the defeat of England and America in World War III comes the reign of the Antichrist. The last 5 verses in Daniel chapter 11 will bring some consolation to Americans, because we know that the Antichrist will also be defeated in a very short while. In verse 41, Daniel writes, "And he," that is the Antichrist, "shall enter into the glorious land, which is Jerusalem, and many shall fall. And these only shall be saved out of his hand, Edom, Moab, and the principal children of Ammon." Now we know that the Antichrist will subdue the entire world. So isn't it rather unusual that 3 obscure neighborhoods in Jordan, namely Edom, Moab, and Ammon, will escape the Antichrist? Especially since Edom and Moab do not even exist any longer. We have to look at these 3 locations as symbols, because they symbolize the 3 groups who will escape the Antichrist: the raptured Protestants, the protected Catholics, and the converted Jews. Who were these individuals? Ammon was the son which Lot had by his own youngest daughter. He therefore symbolizes the youngest of these 3 denominations, and that is the Protestants. Moab was the son which Lot had by his own eldest daughter. He therefore represents the eldest of the 3 denominations, and that is the converted Jews. Edom is a nickname for Esau, and it means red. In other words, Edom was a redneck, or an outdoorsman. He therefore symbolizes the protected Catholics, who flee into the desert away from the Antichrist. Edom, Moab, and Ammon must be looked at symbolically. They do indeed escape the Antichrist, but only in their symbolic terms. Now in verse 43, Daniel describes the 3 locations which do not escape the Antichrist: Egypt, Libya, and Ethiopia. Again, these locations must be looked at symbolically. We know the Antichrist will subdue the entire planet. Therefore, Egypt, Libya, and Ethiopia must symbolize all nations of the world. Let's look at this hidden symbolism. Egypt was settled by Ham, one of the 3 sons of Noah. In fact, in Psalm 105, Egypt is called the land of Ham. Ethiopia was settled by Sem, one of the other sons of Noah. And the people in Ethiopia are called Semites. Now the offspring of the 3rd son of Noah, who was Japheth, traveled north across Europe, and I believe they crossed over the Straits of Gibraltar, and some of them came down and settled in North Africa, including Libya. Therefore, these 3 nations symbolize all nations of the world, because all the nations of the world are descended from Noah through his 3 sons, Sem, Ham, and Japheth. We need to remember that God reveals the future not to scare people, but to prepare them. Please do not listen to the false prophets and the televangelists and their multi-million-dollar industries. They will never tell you the truth about the end times, because that is not a popular message. You need to know that Barack Obama is the last president of the United States. You need to know that he will lead us into defeat in World War III. The prophecies of Daniel are being unsealed in these end times. We need to know what is soon to come upon the earth. Now, if you would like more information, simply write to the address you see on your screen.